Okay, so first of all, welcome back. And today, what I want to do is focus on the two major breakthroughs in peace. So today is a happy session in a lot of ways, between the Israel, first of all, and the Palestinians. The major breakthrough in 1993. We call this Oslo 1 because there was a second agreement that followed up on that. And so I want to just talk about many of the things that led to that very powerful and moment in the history of this conflict. And then shortly right after, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, the second major peace treaty that Israel has signed with one of its neighbors. So both of those are huge, are really important and very complex. And I think I want to begin by going back to where we left off last week, which is to think about in a more analytic way about what was going on in the late 70s that ultimately led to two contradictory kinds of outcomes. One was this momentous Camp David Accords in 1979, the signing of those accords with Egypt, Israel's peace agreement with Egypt. And then the other was this invasion of Lebanon, this war in to the north of Israel. So from the perspective of Israel, I want to talk about the narratives first. From the perspective of Israel, we'll do the Israeli narrative first. As they see it, the peace agreement with Egypt proves that when Israel's offered genuine peace, when the hand was extended, when Sadat came, Israel's ready. Israel responds. That's the idea, and the hope is that from now on, other nations might see that and respond to that, and see that as an option, right? Also, a second subsidiary piece of this is that without Egypt in conflict with Israel, that takes off the board a huge military capability that other Arab countries would find it even much less, that they would be much less capable of launching a military attack on Israel without Egypt in their corner. Israel also saw Anwar Sadat as having moved independently, as pursuing a separate peace. This was about Egypt and about and Israel. This wasn't about the Palestinians. Now, it's true that Sadat stated that there can be no peace with Egypt without an agreement with the Palestinians, and that was really important. But from the Israelis' perspective, that this is something that Sadat had to do, and it wasn't he was just paying lip service here. So, and a third piece of this that's from Israel's perspective is that this peace treaty, over the long term, it has survived, and that is a very, very, very important accomplishment in terms of Israel, despite the fact that there's conflict with other countries. Egypt and Israel have sustained this peace agreement over the long term. Now, but there's this other set of events, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, or as Israel calls it, Operation Peace for Galilee, referring to the Galilee Sea. And now their initial, the way that Israel sees it initially is that this is a preventative war. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is in the southern part of Lebanon, and they're launching terror attacks on Israel. So they had to neutralize the tactical advantage of these Katyusha rockets that were coming out of into northern Israel from what Israel called Fatah land, this area of southern Lebanon that the Palestinian PLO had dominated. And a second piece of this is that southern Lebanon itself had become like a state within a state. Palestinians were going to emerge as this independent country inside of Lebanon and build institutions there, and then transfer those to the West Bank. And so Israel had to stop this. So when Prime Minister Begin looked at this, he said, look, we're doing something very in a limited way. We're just trying to get the PLO out of the South. But they obviously kept going. And the question is why? Israel's explanation for that is that this wasn't their intention. This was Ariel Sharon. This was just General Ariel Sharon, defense minister, who had bigger notions. I kind of reminded of Truman and General MacArthur in the Korean War. If you can go back that far, MacArthur wanted to go all the way in and dislodge push the communists completely out. And Truman had never okayed that. And actually, he ended up firing the very, very popular General MacArthur, removed him from power because he disobeyed his order. Well, Sharon was told explicitly by Menachem Begin, Prime Minister Begin, don't go past the 45 kilometers north of the border. Beyond that, the Katyusha rockets couldn't reach us, so push them back past 45 kilometers, and that's good enough. That's all we wanted. So Sharon, though, was seen by the Israelis as the explanation for this, as having tricked the Israeli cabinet to give him the green light to do this, and then took advantage of this.
I think Scott is lost. Hopefully he'll come back in just a second. See what happens.
I'm here. I have no idea what happened there. That was totally weird. I have no idea why that happened. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm very sorry about that. That was so strange. Okay, so first of all, for the Palestinians, the Arab-Israeli, the Egyptian peace agreement was a betrayal. There would at this point, the Palestinians understand, just as the Israeli. It's funny how in these narratives, the Palestinians and the Israelis, they're kind of seeing eye to eye on a few things. Like, without the Egyptians militarily, the chances for the Arabs to overcome Israel was severely diminished, if not impossible. They both see that. Israel says that's a wonderful thing. And the Palestinians, it means the idea of an armed invasion, trying to get to other Arab countries to do this, was impossible. This is as they see it, this is the final nail in the coffin in this Arab-Israeli armed struggle, right? So I notice how I put to armed struggle. So from the Egyptians' perspective, when they did this whole thing, they wanted to sort of Sadat wanted to set out a new model for trying to deal with and the Israelis wanted to set up this new model, and the Palestinians are seeing this as a disappointment, but they're also getting it, that isn't going to happen, right? However, they also say that the Egypt is basically just trading acceptance of the occupation of the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip and the continued occupation of the Palestinians, they're trading that, they're accepting that in return for the Sinai. That's all they wanted. They're selfish. They don't care about us, right? So of course the Palestinians say, well, it's no wonder that we then turn away from Egypt and towards Syria and towards Iraq for support for us. We've lost support from Egypt. We need support from other regional powers that can help us. Now, when they look at the Lebanon invasion, the war in Lebanon in '82, they say this is exactly what you should have expected. Israel is an aggressor, and without any power, without Egypt there to stop them, with Syria distracted, of course they're just going to go and direct their aggression against the Palestinians. First, they expelled the Palestinian leadership out of the West Bank and Gaza, and then now they're going to push the Israelis, the Palestinians out of Lebanon. I think somebody's trying to raise their hand, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Maybe not. Okay. All right. So that's what they expected. Now, okay. There are a couple of Arab narratives that are worth kind of identifying here as well as we move into the 80s and 90s. Two main ones between 1975 and 1986. One has to do with this idea of negotiations and diplomacy as a way to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict versus continued armed struggle with Israel. Now, in part, the Egyptian peace agreement was kind of, in a weird way, a confirmation that the armed struggle from 1973, when Sadat attacked, right? Egypt and Syria did the Yom Kippur surprise attack on Israel, that sort of laid the groundwork for Israel to say, whoa, we better bargain, we better give back this. That from their perspective, the Arab world, Israel's willingness to work and to come to an agreement, come to the bargaining table, and to give back the Sinai was evidence that the armed struggle, from some perspectives, was working. The second narrative, however, is that Egypt had given up on the armed struggle, right? And that they had gotten what they wanted because they finally agreed to go in a diplomatic way. Now, another perspective on what's happening in Israel with one of the things I talked about a little bit last week, which is a very important thinking about going forward here, is the rise of the Likud. The Likud government, which is the right-wing, more conservative government, first time that Israel had ever had any other government other than the left-leaning Labor government in the history of Israel was in 1977. And this idea that, Likud is hard line, that they're more militaristic, that they're less willing to, that they're much more aggressive. Look at what happens in Lebanon, says the Arab world, right? From that perspective, Egypt was negotiating with Israel out of fear, right? If they didn't deal with Israel now, from the diplomatic perspective, they were bound to never get their Sinai back. They were done with decades of war for the Arab cause, and it wasn't working, and they couldn't come up against the Likud government, which would be even harder to deal with. Now, from all of this, the rest of the Arab world said, okay, I guess if Egypt's going after theirs and they got the Sinai back, maybe every country should be pursuing, Syria should look for its own gain in the Golan Heights. Jordan should be dealing with how they're going to resolve this issue about the West Bank and its control or lack thereof, and water rights and all these things. And so the Palestinian cause becomes a footnote increasingly. It becomes less and less important. Now, Egypt, for its part, always maintained that, step one was to have this peace agreement, and step two was an agreement on Palestinian autonomy. But for Jordan, and this is the last piece I want to really kind of comment at in terms of these narratives here. The way they see this Camp David agreement between Egypt and Israel is that Egypt basically broke ranks with the rest of the Arab world, similar to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and that this weakened the Arab collective position vis-a-vis Israel. But then events changed things for Jordan. The Iran-Iraq war really shifted the way Jordan looked at Egypt. And the reason why was that Egypt was helping out Iraq with military assistance, and Jordan and Iraq were longtime allies. So the friend of my friend is my friend, just like the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. In this case, Jordan starts to see Egypt as a potential ally. And so improvement started in the late 70s in the early 80s between Egypt and Jordan in their relations. In 1984, King Hussein of Jordan and Mubarak, the new president of Egypt, met, and they started to resume diplomatic relations starting in 1984. So not too long after the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal in 1979, 5 years later, Egypt and Jordan are starting along this path. But okay, so that sets up things to think a little bit more about what's happening that I want to focus on now in this period leading up to things. But I just wanted to open it up and see if you guys had any questions about those various differing perspectives about mostly about Camp David, but also about the Lebanon war. All right, we don't have any questions. Oh, I've been, Madalena, if you are still here, somehow I am unable to share my screen, but I need to share my screen. So, I hope she can see this. Excuse me for a second. I'm just typing her chat. Okay, well, you know what? I'll just have to talk to you guys, and you guys feel free. We have a small group, so don't be shy about asking me questions as we go along. Ria, I don't know if you can see that it's only 6 of us, so 5 of us really, including me. So go ahead and ask away as we go along. And I want to begin, this is what I want to talk about today is the lead up to Oslo, beginning with the first Intifada, which means uprising in Arabic. And it's basically the years between about 1987 and 1994 that I'm going to be really focused on here. In this period of time, we we can start out by looking at this uprising that happens in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, the Intifada, the first one. There's two of them that we can point to, and what that does to the conflict, because it has profound impact, to a launching of a Madrid peace conference, multilateral peace conference in 1991, which sets in motion the fascinating process that results in the emergence of a declaration of principles for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we oftentimes refer to as the framework, Oslo framework. And then the 1990. I have a feeling that there's some issue with me being the host here. I hope you guys are still with me. Let's see if that works now. Nope. I'm not sure what has happened. I don't think the internet problem is on my end. I think it has to do with the Jewish Collaborative linking. So I'm trying to hopefully that will work. Anyway, so so we're going to go all the way from the first Intifada. Oh, I'm the host now. Okay, let's try it now. Okay. All right, good. It'll be better. Okay. Oh, good. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so this is going to take us all the way from that Intifada to the Madrid Peace Conference and the process that ultimately results in the Oslo Agreement, and then the Jordanian peace agreement as well. So let me just say a few things summarizing what we're going to talk about, and then we'll kind of get into some of the details. This period of time also sees the end of the Cold War, which is critically important because the Soviet Union falls apart. And then shortly thereafter, we have the Persian Gulf War of 1991, which has a profound impact on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then this very first ever Arab-Israeli peace conference, multilateral peace conference in Madrid. So we move from a bipolar world, Cold War, to a unipolar international system. And that has very important, if you think about how the entire conflict has evolved, what we've been talking about from my first set of lectures, the idea that these world powers, whether it's Britain or the United States and Soviet Union, kind of fight proxy wars or at least are in competition for the allegiance of the different actors, the Arab countries, the various Arab countries, and Israel and the Palestinians. So you can imagine that having the Soviets essentially out of the picture and the United States as being the dominant power now by far is going to have a profound impact on this. Second thing is, yes, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, yeah, just very quickly, could you just define, I have heard the bipolar and unipolar, I have heard of it before, but could you just define I know they're just they're basic terms in international relations, but I'd be really grateful if you could just clarify those terms. That'd be great if you could.
For sure. No, it's a great question. Thanks for that question. Well, it's very important to understand, so I don't want to go past this. When we talk about the Cold War, the United States and the former Soviet Union, the United States felt after the essentially after World War II ended, that there were any place that communism made inroads in another nation was a defeat for Western liberal democracy, and that the United States wanted to pursue a worldwide international foreign policy that was to contain the Soviet Union wherever it would be. And so in that context, the alliances that the United States would make in the Arab-Israeli conflict with Israel, and sometimes we talked about this with Egypt, Soviet Union was competing for influence in that region, not only because of the ideological reasons, trying to win a war of communism against the democracy, but also because of the economic and military advantages that one of the sides could have by having alliances with other countries. So Soviets pursuing alliance with Syria, pursuing an alliance later with Iran, versus the United States pursuing alliances with Saudi Arabia, of course, with Israel, and the Palestinians seeking out connections with the Soviets through the Czechs, for example, for arms and things like, all sorts of ways that worked. Now, with the defeat of the Soviet Union and its military power in disarray, its economic power in disarray, its political power really just ended after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the United States becomes the only true global superpower. And because of that, it really matters for the other countries in the Arab world. Like, if they don't have a benefactor that can counter the influence of the United States with Israel, that means that Egypt, Syria, Jordan, they have to start to think, do they really want to be at loggerheads with the United States, who supports Israel and democracy, or do they want to try to figure out a way to enter back into a relationship with the United States and have that be positive? So I hope that explains things. So another way to think about it is that there's that effort to balance regionally was kind of replaced by direct American intervention over and over again. Just to go back to the Lebanon War, United States, after the invasion of Israel into Lebanon, all the way up in the chaos of that civil war between the Christian minority and the Muslim majority and different armed factions, and then there's the PLOs involved, and I mean, it was chaos, right? United States intervened and put had huge marine installations in southern Lebanon, which became a disaster for the United States when there was a terrorist bombing that killed 282 US Marines, and the United States left. So the United States gets drawn into this as well because of its unipolar authority. So when we get into the 90s and Iraq invades Kuwait to steal its oil fields, right? The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, as I like to tell my students, Daddy Bush, pulled together a huge international coalition and attacked back to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And this is the first Gulf War. But the Arab countries split in where their allegiance was going to be. Most notably, I'll point out, and we'll come back to it in more detail, the Palestinians decide to throw in with Saddam Hussein to support Saddam Hussein, which was a horrible mistake for them strategically. This is also the moment where the Egyptians and the Saudis become much more important. After 8 years of war between Iran and Iraq, Iran was terribly weakened. Iraq is now doing this crazy invasion of Kuwait that's going to destroy it. The Soviets are out of Afghanistan. And so Egypt and Saudi Arabia become the more dominant players in the region. Then there's the First Intifada, which breaks out in early December of 1987. And in case you're wondering, like, how am I jumping around here? I'm going to come back to all these things. I just want to actually give us a full picture of this as a single chunk of time, right? So you've got the decline of you have got the ascension of the United States as the most important power in the region, in the world, but in this region. Secondly, you've got this emergence of you got the Gulf War, which really divides up the Arab world into those who are with Iraq and those who are with the United States coalition. You've got the emergence now of Egypt and Saudi Arabia as a much more powerful, those are the two big powerhouses in the region. And Syria is in disarray as well. It's part of the, it did go on the side of the United States in the anti-Iraq coalition, but that didn't prevent it from being severely weakened by its loss of its Soviet patron. The PLO, which didn't side with the Americans, are severely weakened by this as well. And then there's this Intifada, which breaks out in early December of 1987. And it surprises a lot of people, including the PLO. Right. So I want to make it clear the First Intifada, in a way, is this, well, it's not in a way, is a grassroots uprising in the West Bank and Gaza Strip that threatens the authority of the PLO elite, the Arafat and Query, which we'll talk about later, his people. So they kind of lose this this authority, because the Intifada is led by a young group of militant leaders that emerge in the West Bank and in Gaza. It's very important. Finally, this period closes with the signing of these two major peace agreements, the Israeli PLO Oslo Accords and the Jordanian Israeli Peace Treaty. Okay, so I want to take us through this entire process and hopefully draw it all together in the next hour, okay? We'll focus on the Intifada, the Madrid Conference, the Israeli PLO Oslo Accords, and the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement. So, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the unification of Germany a year later, and then in the 1980s, you got Glasnost, right? And Perestroika, if that reminds you of anything. Gorbachev's effort to try to soften the hold of communism and dictatorship. Economic liberalization came first, and then political freedom. And you get 1 million Jews that are finally able to leave. 1 million Jews who are able to leave the Soviet Union. And a lot of them go to Israel. A lot of them go to Israel, which is going to have an impact demographically and politically, because most of those Soviet emigres to Israel become Likud voters, supporters of the Likud. They see any sort of liberal approach to war making, potential antagonists as echoing their experience with the hardline Soviets. So they don't like that. Anyways, but now in Israel, they've got a situation, right? They've got millions of new refugees coming, and they don't have a lot of money, so they need support. And they turn to the United States for loan guarantees, $10 billion in loan guarantees. Now, I'm going to come back to in a minute. We'll focus on these Intifada, but I stay with this for a minute. The end of the Iran-Iraq war, very intense war. We're talking about 100,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people on both sides dying, and that there's a ceasefire there. I'm going to let Rosalie in. A ceasefire to that Iran-Iraq war in 1988, right? By the end of that war, both Iran and Iraq can start going back into the oil market. And that leads to a huge decline in oil prices worldwide, right? They were fighting a war. They weren't producing oil. Now, all of a sudden, there's a glut in the market, in which, of course, supply and demand, prices go down, which makes it hard for Iraq to pay off its war debt. It can't reconstruct. It has less and less and less money. And so, but more generally, throughout the Arab world, there's a declining economy as oil prices go down. And so Arab leaders are less and less able, or less and less willing, or able, or both, to provide for the basic needs of their populations. And so just to give you an example, in 1989 in Jordan, there are riots over food. And there are increased demands that Jordan shouldn't focus on the West Bank. That's the damn Palestinians. Let's focus on the people in Jordan who need food, who need jobs, who need basic care, right? And then you got this Intifada breaking out. The United States and Israel had already said that they would not deal with the Palestinian Liberation Organization unless it, quote, publicly and unequivocally accepted UN Resolution 242. And you recall what that was. That was after the 1967 war, right? That Israel would have to hand back these territories from their perspective. Yasser Arafat, who's the chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Tunis now, right? Arafat wanted the United States to recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination. And the Reagan administration said no. The US was now seen by the Palestinians as having come full circle to back the Israelis' position. No Palestinian state. That's what the United States, that's what Reagan was supporting. Instead, the Reagan team, James Baker, Secretary of State, wanted a Jordanian solution. And what does that mean? Any thoughts about that? Michael, you could probably answer that. I think you're here. They don't want the Palestinians to be.
I'm sorry, I was in the middle of eating something and my dessert.
It's good.
Well, they wanted them to be part of Jordan.
Right. And Jordan should take care of governing them and dealing with them, and not to have an independent Palestinian state. They should be citizens of Jordan.
In fact, if I may say, Jordan, even for many, many years, used to pay the former civil people who used to work for the Jordanian government for many, many years, because they would not, Jordan would not recognize the West Bank as different than Jordan.
Yes, very, very important. So Israel agrees with Jordan on that. They see eye to eye, and you can start to see again these weird ways in which Israel's kind of agreeing in how they see the world. Jordan says there's no independent Palestine. Israel says there's no independent. Reagan agrees with Israel, but they say unlike the Israelis, that any negotiations have to include Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza as part of that negotiations. And in 1984, there are elections in Israel. And the Labor Party, led by Shimon Peres, won a slight plurality, but he can't put together a full majority in the Knesset. There are 15 minority parties now at that point. It's a really close, I mean, and so Peres accepts a coalition government with Likud, a power sharing government. The ministerial posts, defense minister, right, are shared equally. And the idea was that the Labor Party, which is presumably more amenable to negotiations with the Palestinians, not necessarily, but let's just for a minute simplify things, would govern for the first year and a half, and Shimon Peres would be the prime minister. Yitzhak Shamir of the Likud party would be the foreign minister. So here's Peres and Rabin as his defense minister, by the way. And then here's Yitzhak Shamir as the foreign minister. Rabin is actually Shimon Peres's rival in the Labor Party. He's the defense minister. I kind of think of, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, both serving in Washington's government. They agree in their support, commitment to Israel here, but they see things quite differently, right? And Ariel Sharon, who was, you remember, the now discredited general who led the invasion all the way up to Beirut in Lebanon in the 82 war. Now he's been put in the Likud government as one of the ministers. He's the Minister of Commerce and Industry. So now you got all of the players that are going to be so important for the next 20 years in Israel are in this government. In 1986, Shamir is going to become the prime minister. So Peres, knowing that he's got a year and a half, wants to get a settlement with King Hussein of Jordan. And he wants to do it in a way, and here's where it's counter to the way we might think of things. Peres is, look, I want to get an agreement, but I don't want this guy involved. I don't want the PLO in there, right? And so instead, and Peres's hope is politically is that if he can get this agreement, then he can call for new elections and never have to hand over leadership to Yitzhak Shamir. Going back to Shamir, right? Now, of course, Yitzhak Shamir, seeing which side his bread is buttered on, recognizes that if Peres gets this deal with Hussein, they're out of power. So they oppose any negotiations with Jordan. And they instead they say, look, let's do what we know will get in the way of all this. Let's build more settlements. Now, King Hussein has got right? You're looking at this picture, and you heard what Michael just said. The Palestinians, the Jordanians have not gotten along since 1974. They got kicked out, the PLO. Arafat was the leader then. So what are they doing together here? Well, they have to come to an agreement. In 1985, Hussein, along with Arafat on his side, calls for a Palestinian state on the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as part of as the capital. And he wants that to be, here's where it's Jordanian still, part of a confederation with Jordan. Think about the United States. We have California and New York and Illinois. They want Jordan, but the West Bank will be a Palestinian state, part of Jordan, under Jordan, right? Israel would, under this approach, would get out of the occupied territories on the West Bank, and Arafat, by signing off on this, was implicitly, not yet explicitly, but implicitly abandoning the Palestinian Liberation Organization's 1968 charter, which says we call for the full elimination of Israel. So this is a de facto acceptance, the first time, of Israel. And it marks this continuing move towards a pragmatism on the part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that they want something. They're going to have to deliver for their people. Otherwise, they're going to lose authority. If they don't have a country and they keep getting kicked out of Jordan and now Lebanon, and there's nothing to show for it, they're going to be in trouble. So they're willing to do something as a step towards the final elimination of Israel. They're not negating that's what their goal is, but they're down this path, right? And really, the truth of the matter is that Hussein doesn't like Arafat at all, doesn't want Arafat there, doesn't like the leadership of the PLO, doesn't like the Fatah. He recognizes that basically he wants the West Bank, but he knows that he can't do it without the PLO being legitimate in the Arab world. And Arafat knows that he can't get a toehold in the West Bank without gaining United States support for the PLO. And the way to get that is to sort of come in the back door and say, okay, Reagan, you're calling for a Jordanian confederation. We're not really agreeing to that with the Reagan plan, but we're willing to do business with Jordan, which is a signal to the United States that the Palestinian Liberation Organization might be in play. Now, all of this goes back to that big systemic change that I talked about, right? With the fall of the Soviet Empire, these state players and non-state players, the Palestinians, are maneuvering. They're maneuvering. And they know that Israel, its strongest ally is the United States, the single most powerful player in the world. Okay. So now Arafat is problematic though, because he won't accept UN Resolution 242. And he says, I'm not going to accept it until I'm recognized in the international diplomatic arena. And this means stalemate. There ain't nothing going to happen. Now, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Karen, there you go, your former country's leader, hardline conservative, says, look, I'm going to go and break the deadlock. And that's usually Reagan's, her ally, her right-wing ally. I mean, Reagan and Thatcher kind of dominate this period of time in terms of this rise of conservatives. You want to think about Trumpism in the current period, right? You think about Reaganism and Thatcherism as the time in the 80s, right? So the fact that Reagan said, I'm not dealing with the PLO, and now Thatcher saying, well, maybe I will. She brings Fatah members of the Palestinian National Council, the PNC, to meet her in October of 1985 in London. But then, in that very moment, violence. There's a Palestinian assassination of 3 Israelis in Cyprus. And of course, this is part of a bigger elite Palestinian Liberation Organization terrorist group that is linked directly to Fatah and to Arafat. But Arafat says, like, I denounce this killing. Still, Shimon Peres retaliates and bombs the PLO headquarters outside of Tunis, and he kills more than 50 people. And it's over. This whole thing that like the PLO is going to come in under Jordan and they're going to kind of get to a peace. No, that's done. Reagan calls the Israeli bombing of the PLO headquarters a legitimate response and said later that it was, quote, understandable, but unfortunate. I can't do my best, Reagan. It is understandable, but unfortunate. I'm trying to do my Reagan invitation. Now, Tunisians are very upset by this. Morocco doesn't like this. They, once again, you have the PLO with you, and that's kind of dangerous. Morocco's like, we kind of agreed to house the Palestinians at Washington's request after the Lebanon war, and now this is bad. And then October, that same year, there's the hijacking of a cruise ship, the Achille Lauro, in the Mediterranean. And this is horrible, right? There's this murder of Leon Klinghoffer, who's in a wheelchair. They throw him overboard in his wheelchair and let him drown. This is all part of this. It's very, very, it gets tons of media attention, television attention. And the fact that they murdered a disabled Jew in his wheelchair and dumped his body overboard really turns public opinion, sours on the PLO. America once again sees the PLO as terrorists, not as negotiating partners, or at least at best in favor of Arafat, that they're unable to control those who are under their command. Thatcher's like, done. We're done with the PLO. And Perez says, look, I don't want to deal with the Palestinian liberation, and I don't have to. The United States doesn't want me to. And so now I can just deal with Jordan and and Israel. And the US says, good. Reagan had, and I'm going to come to you in 1 second, Michael. Reagan had viewed Israel as part of his approach to fighting communism still. And his Secretary of State, George Shultz, really wanted a much closer alliance with Israel, and including, I think I mentioned before that Israel, the United States had, Reagan had this penchant for doing things that his staff couldn't control. And one of the things he did, which really upset his own defense establishment, was that he made a major speech that said, we're going to have soon a strategic defense initiative we're going to be able to shoot down any incoming missiles from the Soviets with laser technology. And the defense establishment knew that this was it was like they were writing it out on a piece of paper. They had not really done it. And Reagan's pretending on a world stage, the president of the United States, saying like, we have this this is like, it's going to happen any day now. And so Reagan and Schultz really are hoping that Israel can help get this SDI initiative very quickly, technologically up to speed. Michael, go ahead. Sorry, I waited a long time.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to make sure the point comes across regarding Klinghoffer.
Oh.
They did not murder him and then threw his body overboard.
No.
Throwing overboard alive in his wheelchair.
Yes, absolutely. It was
the sentence and the way you expressed it explained differently, that they first murdered him and then they threw him out. That's not the case.
Oh yeah, no, he was
alive.
I didn't mean it that way. Yes, I know.
But the sentence also is that way.
They drown him that way. Yes, you're right. Yeah, they drown him, and I knew that. Yes, you're right. That's incorrectly put onto this PowerPoint. I'll have to change that. That's not what I meant. So thank you for that. But that inhumanity is it just ruins any effort of Arafat to try to moderate and say, well, we're not going to do anyway. So at this point, there's this Arab summit that's going to be held in Amman, Jordan in November of 1987. And the Palestinians are convinced, I wonder if it's on the next page. Yeah, I'll come to this in a second, but the Palestinians are convinced that their cause is being totally ignored. The conference in Jordan in 1987 focuses on the Iran-Iraq war. A Palestinian National Council conference that had happened 6 months earlier in 86, Arafat conceded that to other factions within the Palestinian National Council, Fatah agreed with more radical factions that there's no way to negotiate any kind of agreement with King Hussein, and that's what it was. And so months after this, the Intifada breaks out, and which is an uprising. It's mostly focused on Israel, but also at Palestinian leadership. And let me just say a few things about this, and I'm going to go back to the slide of the. Let me see. I just my slides might be a little bit. Oh, okay. Yeah. So first of all, there are a lot of Palestinians who have been working in the West Bank throughout the 1970s. I mean, laborers, they're getting paid. Economically, Palestinians in the West Bank are doing quite well relative to Arabs in Lebanon or in Egypt, right? And so for most of the 1970s, the experience of the occupation, particularly on the West Bank, less so in the Gaza Strip, was that it was fairly benign. The settlements that was being complained about at a world stage were not really in Arab areas. But once Begin took office in 1977, as I noted earlier, the settlements skyrocket. And they're now being moved into Arab communities or right next to Arab communities. Now, from Ariel Sharon's perspective, he's the defense minister, this is meant to intimidate Palestinians and get them to leave, right? And in the 1980s, there's more of that kind of strategy, effort to try to push around Arabs in the West Bank. And there are a lot of beatings, there are a lot of arrests in response to Arab demonstrations. And after 1985, Israel would often fence off land in the West Bank and say, hey, this is our land. This is Israel's property, and give the owners no legal recourse at all. The military was the law. So the Israeli military was under Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And his approach to these Arab protests in 1985 was to respond with, quote unquote, an iron fist. That's Yitzhak Rabin who says this. There's a whole campaign. And this is really important. Go ahead, Michael. Yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm objecting to the fact that you asserted that the Israelis would simply encircle a territory, an area, and take it away from legal owners of the land. You have to show me one such case, because anytime such thing happen, they immediately have access to the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court judge, who is an Arab Palestinian, one of them, was visiting Beth El in Orange County, Aliso one time, and he explained to everybody that any human rights violation can be accessed to the Supreme Court immediately.
Well, I'm not doubting that there are many cases that come up there, but what I'm trying to paint a picture of is that there's a lot of what we might call today microaggressions.
Yeah, and I'll accept this one, I'll accept that one, absolutely, but they would not take legal ownership of land from their owners. They did not do it.
Well, my sources are saying it's happening at this period of time.
Tell me which
I'm
are
not
the
living in
sources.
85.
I
Yes.
I'd love to hear about the
Your
sources.
textbook, yes, the textbook by
Which one?
the one that I've assigned that I've been lecturing out of all this time.
Give me the name.
I will. Okay.
Thank you.
You have it. It's on your syllabus, Michael. It's there. You can get it. I'll make sure you see it. Chapter 7 of that book by Shaul Feldman, I'm not sure why this is happening over and over again. And Debbie, I'm not sure why you can't hear, but can you hear me now? Okay. Suddenly I got disconnected and I'm not sure why this is happening. So, anyway, I might be having, I think there's an issue on the, with my internet, so we'll just keep going and hopefully it'll work. But anyway, so now the youth in the West Bank and in Gaza are starting to see the Palestinian Liberation Organization as increasingly impotent, that they are being, they're getting some harsh military rule. And the elders are saying, you have to just keep your head down and just deal with it. That they're supposed to endure, that they're supposed to, that this is a valued trait of sumud, right? That this fortitude, and then wait for their leadership to make changes. Did everyone just freeze? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're fine. We can hear you. You are freezing though.
You know, maybe I think I'll move to another room where I'm going to have better internet access. Okay, let's see if that works. So just give me 1 second, take a break. It'll literally take 15 seconds.
Take 5.
Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Rosalie. You look great.
Oh, I just came from a concert. Thank you.
Oh, good. Good. Was that Rosh Chodesh program?
Oh, you were?
Yeah. Yeah. It was nice. It was small, which is one of the reasons I went to support the gang, you know.
Right.
So what was the concert?
It was at a high school in Laguna. Susan had gotten an extra ticket through some organization and asked me to go.
That's
And
nice.
it was just delightful. They weren't high school kids. This was a professional group. I don't have the catalog in front of me, but they were
I'm
excellent.
sure this should work a lot better. So let's.
You're back.
I'm sorry about that. I guess my Wi-Fi was just not acting the way I wanted to. Okay, so let me get back to my screen here and hopefully, oh, now I can't see it. All right, well, I'm just gonna keep lecturing and for some reason I've lost my host status. And I think that's
I think Donna has it, and Donna needs to give it back to you or make you co-host. Something happened, something to happen. You got disconnected, and when that happens, somebody else automatically gets host. So
well, go ahead. And if Donna, if you can figure out how to make me host, you let me know, okay? In the meantime, I want to cover some more material here. So Arabs in the territory, whether in the West Bank and Gaza, whether they're protesting or not, they're confronting Israeli troops on a daily basis. And this is particularly intense in Gaza. Now, there are major flashpoints along the way. In the early 1980s, one major flashpoint is in Hebron, a city which you recall back from my talk about the British Mandate. There was a massacre of Jews in 1929, a Palestinian massacre of Jews there. And settlers were now trying to bring back a community, a Jewish community in Hebron since the 1970s as part of the Gush Emunim movement, the Greater Israel movement. And they had Israeli military protection to do this. In May of 1980, some Palestinians attacked the settlers there, and they killed 6 of them, and they wounded 16 more. And there was a Jewish response, car bombing of several Arab mayors as a response. In 1983, again in Hebron, there was a death of a student, a Jewish student at a yeshiva there, and a killing of a yeshiva student. And a response was a bombing of Arab schools. And that same group almost succeeded in trying to blow up the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this becomes intense in Hebron. It's very intense in Gaza. There's extreme population density in Gaza. Refugees from 1948 and 1967, both those wars make up about 3/4 of the population there. Let me give you an example. In Jabalia is a refugee camp. Housing in Jabalia, this Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza, is double the density of Manhattan. And the population is incredibly young. Okay, great. I think I can do it. Thank you, Donna. And like about half, yeah, here we go. About half of the, let's see if I can get this here.
By the way, it's Jabalia.
Okay. Thank you. So this, about half the people who live there, thank you, are children. And Gazans now work in low-wage labor. Before the Intifada, about 70,000 Gazans were working in Israel. And after the Intifada, that kind of gets cut off. And water was also being restricted to Gazan agriculture, and therefore the citrus industry that was really big in Gaza was just strangled. So Israel, under Ariel Sharon, opposed these Gaza protests even more by using bulldozers and deportations. Now, it's really important for me to talk about this because Gaza has a long tradition of Islam, particularly the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is based out of Cairo. This is an Egyptian Muslim group, the Muslim Brotherhood. And most of the offshoots—
It's illegal, made illegal in Egypt.
Yeah, okay. Most of the offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood are calling for jihad as a personal reform. And they didn't really see themselves in Gaza as an alternative to the PLO, who they supported. The Muslim Brotherhood on Gaza created the University of Gaza. They created the University of Al-Najah and Hebron University in the West Bank. So they're about building institutions. But then in the mid-1980s, Islamic Jihad is formed. And the Islamic Jihad is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they start to argue for armed resistance to Israel. As the PLO starts to decline in the mid-1980s, local militants in Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank, but predominantly in the Gaza Strip, become increasingly important. In 1987, there's a stabbing of an Israeli by a Gazan. A tank transport crashes into several Arab cars the next day. There's a rumor that this is that the Israeli driver who did that car crash was related to the Israeli who had been stabbed to death, and that this was revenge. And at the funerals for this are these huge protests, and that's where the Intifada gets launched. The uprising has begun. So it starts out predominantly as relatively nonviolent, throwing rocks, but and it's led by these three leaders, predominantly from, and this is what's important, think that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, its headquarters is where? Morocco. These leaders are from the West Bank. This is Hanan Ashrari. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. Oh, Faisal Husseini, and Hanan Ashrawi and Saeed Erekat. And they become the spokespeople for the Intifada. And what's interesting about these three folks is that they are very media savvy. They are very good on using Western media. And you can see how they're dressed. They're not wearing the kafir, and they're not, these are not they don't look like militants. They look like Western politicians, and they sound like Western politicians, but they're very militant. So by the third year of the Intifada in 1990, it starts to become increasingly violent. 160 Israelis and 2,000 Palestinians had been killed. And some of those Palestinians had been killed by other Palestinians who suspect them of having some kind of collaboration with Israel. But Israel's reputation suffers as well. Israel's starting to look like the big Goliath against the little David. So with the emergence of these leaders, though, there's this feeling among the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership, particularly Arafat, that they're losing control. And so there's this, that's one piece of it. And so there's this other piece, which is the rise of Hamas, right? Where did Hamas come from? If you're wondering this, well, here you go. 1979, there's this Iranian revolution. We talked about that last week. In South Lebanon, there's the rise of Hezbollah, which becomes this inspiration to Palestinian Islamists. And that Muslim Brotherhood that I talked about before on Gaza Strip, with the eruption of Intifada, they changed their name to Hamas. So Hamas comes out of the Intifada, and it's an alternative, grassroots, organic response to feeling oppression and feeling microaggressions and feeling frustrated, and the leadership is taking advantage of that. Now, you can look at it two different ways. Either they're the voice of that frustration, fighting against Israel, that's the Palestinian Arab, or they're being exploited, poor Palestinians are being exploited by a power-hungry leader, militant leadership. Hamas says, look, our goals are aligned with, but slightly different than Palestinian liberation. We are not secular. We want an Islamic state in all of historic Palestine. And this idea that, which you're going to hear about in a minute, PLO make a declaration of independence, they don't like this idea of having a two-state solution. The Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1988 endorses the idea of having a single Palestinian state alongside Israel, with its headquarters in East Jerusalem, primarily on West Bank, and includes the Gaza Strip. Hamas says no way. And their charter says we're destroying Israel. That's what we're committed to. So the Palestinian Liberation Organization feels like they're completely losing their control. And in 1991, there's a proposed Madrid conference. And they have to accept that their representation at this conference, which is every Arab country and Israel and the United States, but the Palestinians are not going to be allowed to go. The only way they can be there is as being represented by the Jordanians in a kind of joint delegation, which is kind of crazy because nothing that they're going to do at this conference that involves the Palestinians will be agreed upon until Yasser Arafat in Morocco, who's not part of this delegation, will say yes, because the delegation that's part of the Jordanian Palestinian delegation won't agree to anything until they can get an okay from the PLO, which means they basically get nothing done. Meanwhile, Israel is building more and more settlements. And by mid-1992, the Jewish population of East Jerusalem and the West Bank was 135,000 and 110,000 respectively. And the number of Golan Heights settlers was already 12,600. So now, 1988, major development happens. Jordan declares disengagement. King Hussein says they're going to sever Jordan's legislative and administrative ties, legal and administrative ties to the West Bank. And they're going to cancel $1.5 billion of development plans for the occupied territories, which he had announced in 1986, 2 years earlier. And what Hussein says is, look, Palestinians, you guys got to take over. And we recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. It happens really quick. By August of 1988, Jordan retired nearly every single Jordanian civil servant that was in the West Bank. I'm talking about everybody, you know, from mail deliverers and police officers. They all get out. They leave. 18,000 teachers and health workers and municipal employers are gone. The only ones who are allowed to stay are those 3,000 employees that guard the holy sites, including the Islamic court system. And so anybody who stays, anybody who comes in to Jordan from the West Bank are now considered to be Jordanian. And anybody who stays on the West Bank, the Prime Minister of Jordan says they'll recognize them as quote unquote Palestinians. And then, so this is a big change. 1989, Jordan holds elections for their parliament, and it's the first time that they actually don't have any representatives from the West Bank. So what do the Palestinians do? They declare independence. I'm going to see if this is, yeah, here it is. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but here you can see one of the things, one of the things that I mentioned before is that Jordan and Egypt are starting to move closer together. And you can see them here talking with each other and with Reagan, who endorses a plan that Jordan will be the negotiator. But now Jordan hands off, they disengage from the West Bank. And in November of 1988, Yasser Arafat says, we declare independence, kind of taking a page from the Israeli Declaration of Independence. They feel like they have their country. UN didn't give it to them, but they say we have our own country, Palestine. It's on the West Bank, it's in the Gaza Strip, and it's Jerusalem is our capital. And we affirm the rights of Palestinians to return, right? According to the resolutions of UN Resolution 242. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is they don't really say 242. They say the resolutions of the UN since 1947. Does this mean that the Palestinians have now turned around and have endorsed UN Resolution 242, where they which includes a respect for the territorial integrity of Israel as well as other countries. Are they willing to renounce terrorism? Are they willing to recognize Israel's right to exist? It's not clear here. All of this is sort of happening, and then there's the Gulf War. It's 42 days long. It's absolutely impressive as a US military operation. There's this huge international coalition, and that coalition includes Egypt, Syria, as I mentioned, and Saudi Arabia. Jordan stays out of it, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization sides with Saddam Hussein. Now, during the war, and many of you might remember this, Israel is attacked by Iraq with Scud missiles. And I remember people were in bomb shelters, and the United States basically said, and they're sending these missiles towards Dimona. You have to remember back in 1981 that Israel had sent a mission into Iraq to destroy their nuclear capacity, Osiris reactor. Now it seems like Saddam Hussein is sending missiles to try to take out the Israel's nuclear reactor. They're pretty ineffective, but the United States says to Israel, don't retaliate. We got this. This is our war with Iraq. We're doing this as an international community. We don't want Israel to get involved here. The United States, for the very first time in history, deploys troops in Israel's defense. And Israel agrees to stand down and to not retaliate. Yes, go ahead, Michael.
The reason they asked Israel not to retaliate is because for the very same reason, Israel did not participate in this international, I don't know what to call it, organization. Coalition, yeah. That's the word. Coalition against Saddam. The reason was that the Arab states explicitly said, if Israel joins, we will not, okay? And yes, that's why the Americans pressured Israel do not retaliate, because otherwise the Arabs would be seen as being on the side of the Israelis.
And one of the things that came out of this was this incredible obligation that the United States sort of implicitly had to Israel for doing this, which comes back to Israel's benefit. In 1991, right on the heels of this war, Israel, Syria, and a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation go together with Egypt, with Jordan, and they go to this Madrid peace conference, which is also got the Soviet Union and the United States as sponsoring it. And there are 13 Arab countries, and they focus on a lot of things. They focus on economic development, they focus on water issues, they focus on the environment, they focus on refugees, they focus on arms control. The one thing they don't focus on, Palestine, the Palestinians. So Washington wants Israel to stop building settlements on the West Bank and Gaza, and says under James Baker, look, if you guys keep doing this, we're going to pull our loan guarantees, $10 billion of loan guarantees that you need. And this is the first time the United States since the 70s is saying, we're going to make our aid to Israel contingent on a policy shift that Israel is going to do. So there's this tension growing. Israel's kind of upset that they had to stand down during this war. And this leads us to Oslo. Arafat, here, let me just move this for a second for myself. These are the chief senior architects of the Oslo process. There's this frustration that the Madrid peace conference is not going to get anywhere. And Arafat in particular is worried that they're never going to get to the Palestinian issues. And so he authorizes a number of senior officials, Mahmoud Abbas, who's now president of the PLO, to work with Israeli counterparts, and that's Foreign Minister Shimon Peres. Now we have Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and his assistant Yossi Beilin. And Yossi Beilin is convinced that what's happening in Madrid is not going to get us anywhere. So he decides to engage a number of non-official Israeli people, right, who are not even in the government, to engage in track 2 negotiations to try to get to a set of principles that will put the Israelis and the Palestinians towards a productive dialogue to end their conflict. So the Palestinian officials are Mahmoud Abbas and Ahmed Query, who was basically right, and here is one of Uri Savir, who's Perez's senior official, who's thinking about these track 2 negotiations, and the Israelis pick these 2 academics, Ron Pundek and Yair Hirschfeld, who basically work with their counterparts, Ahmed Query and a couple of other assistants to Query. And it's important for you to know that Yossi Beilin is a longtime peace advocate. And he picks these 2 guys because he feels that they're brilliant. And he wants them to go to Oslo and negotiate on the down low with Ahmed Query. He's seen as kind of a moderate. He's really all about money. He's a banking operative, and a couple of other assistants that Query brings along with him. And they come up with their first draft of a proposed declaration of principles, and that's when they bring it up to these other Israeli participants, who replace the unofficial ones, including Uri Savir, right on the left here, and it was the Director General of the Foreign Ministry, who worked for Shimon Peres, and of course Yitzhak Rabin. And then let me just say one other thing about the architects of Oslo, right? Because eventually it gets us to this historic handshake between Rabin and Arafat. And it would be nothing if it was just a handshake. This includes the recognition of Israel, formal recognition of Israel, and the renouncing of terrorism by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they come up with an agreement of principles. But let me just say a couple things. Abbas, who's basically the head negotiator under, it's Query who really gets these declaration of principles together, but it's Mahmoud Abbas who oversees it. And he's now the president of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And he's one of the founding members of Fatah, along with Yasser Arafat. How did he get in that position? Well, you might think he must have done something. Well, his big thing that he did was he survived. There are a bunch of assassinations in the early 90s of senior Fatah officials by the CIA on one part and by other more militant terrorists as well. So Palestinians are assassinating their leaders, some of the leaders of Fatah, and the CIA is as well. And so one of the few people who's left is Mahmoud Abbas. Fury is the head banker, right? His talent is he understands money. And he is the head of the PLO's foreign investment branch, and he's the director of their the PLO's economic branch. So he's seen as somebody who can strike deals, who understands how to make compromises work for the Palestinians. But everything he does must be go back to Arafat to be approved. And Balin is seen as an advocate for peace, somebody who's come into conflict with Yitzhak Rabin on a number of occasions, because Yitzhak Rabin was seen as more of a hardliner. But Rabin really respected Yossi Balin, despite the fact that they disagreed on a number of different things. So they get this grand bargain, which has major concessions from both sides. But honestly, more of the concessions are from the Palestinians, right? So I just want to point out, to take a look again at this map, and I'm going to summarize some of these declarations. You can see this is what Israel looks like. Here's the West Bank, here's the Golan, and here's the Gaza Strip, right? And here's what the Declaration of Independence basically say. First of all, the PLO recognizes the right of Israel to exist in peace and security, and accepts UN Resolution 242 and renounces terrorism. The charter of PLO charter, which has clauses that denies Israel's existence, are declared as no longer valid or inoperative. That's the first big thing. Secondly, Israel turns around and says, you recognize us, we recognize you as a representative for the Palestinian people. Third, there is going to be an interim government, PISCA, which is my favorite term, the Palestinian interim self-governing authority, which is going to be elected, but they're going to be transitional. And they are not supposed to stay around for longer than 5 years. And then they have to have elections in 1994, no later than 1994. 5 years they got, right? This transitional or interim period of 5 years then starts from July of 1994. And they have to begin permanent status negotiations by the third year of that 5-year period. So you get the process, you're going to have this interim government, and then you have to have elections. And then once that election happens, then you start the clock of 5 years. Okay? And by the third year, you're going to start to negotiate these permanent status negotiations. Permanent status for who? For Palestinians. And these negotiations, that's when we're going to address the following issues. What's going to happen with Jerusalem? What's going to happen with refugees? What's going to happen with the settlements? What's going to happen to make sure that Israel and Palestinians feel secure? Where are the borders of Israel and Palestine going to be? What will the relationship between Palestine and other countries, Israel and other countries neighboring, and any other issues of common interest? In other words, all the hard issues are put on the back burner. And that's the strategy here, right? The strategy is, let's get to an agreement that basically takes care of the most important thing, is we have not been able to recognize each other. We're not able to look at each other across the table and say that we're going to negotiate with each other because we don't recognize that each other exists. That gets taken care of here. And That's why this handshake was so powerful. Now, where this is going to go, the process it sets in motion is to resolve these issues. It's going to be very challenging, to say the least. This is what has stopped everybody from getting to any kind of agreement. These are the things they're fighting about all the time. So, but at least they are now at a point at the end of this to agree to start to address this and there's a process. Now it is a process. The Oslo Declaration of Principles is a declaration of, it's basically endorsing a process that involves democracy and elections. Now, a couple things to note here. Rabin, Prime Minister, and Foreign Minister Perez still favor that, and there's nothing in here. It says that we're going to have an independent Palestinian state that has nothing, that stands alone. They still like the idea of a confederation where Palestinians will have a country, but underneath a Jordanian state. Secondly, Israel doesn't think that they have to give back 100% of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They believe that they can still keep at least 20% of the West Bank and in the corridor between the West Bank and Israel to next to their settlements for security reasons and to protect existing settlements. So that is a different perspective than the Palestinians are going to have. Now, the third thing is that the Arab radicals are completely out of the picture. The idea that you're going to even negotiate a declaration of principles, it comes out of this Gulf War and the fact that the United States is so powerful that Arafat has nowhere else to turn except to sort of turn his face forward to the Western powers, who's Jordan's King Hussein and Israel's and of course primarily the United States. There is nobody else to turn to. And lastly, after the Gulf War, two things. Politically, Arafat was on the side of Saddam Hussein. That was a strategic loser, right? And fiscally, he's got no resources. And so Israel recognizes that Arafat's in a very weak position and that they would have a chance to really force some concessions. Couple other final points, and then we'll come back to the Jordanian peace treaty in a minute, but because I'm going past my time. Oslo completely avoids the issue of East Jerusalem. Before they even negotiate the Declaration of Principles, Uri Savir tells Yossi Beilin tells Uri Savir, you can go there to Oslo and tell Query that we're ready to negotiate, but that Jerusalem's off the table. We're not talking about Jerusalem. But the Palestinians, really, this is important to the Palestinians. Jerusalem being off the table, Israel says all of it is our capital. Palestinians say, no, East Jerusalem is going to be our capital. Second big thing, settlements. America says to Israel, you got to stop doing these settlements. Israel says, look, we're going to keep our settlements. We're not going to dismantle these settlements in Jewish areas. And in particular, Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister who's negotiating this, says, ultimately, the top gun is saying that, look, unless we have territory around Jerusalem, we can't secure Jerusalem. And that's what we need so that we can keep it as part of Israel. So there's a lot of, right at the start of this, that seems like we're going to be at loggerheads all the way through the process. But once the Oslo Agreement gets signed and that you have that historic handshake, now Jordan says, we're not dealing with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are dealing with Israel. They're right. And so the next thing you get very quickly after, a year later, is this historic peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. It helped that Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein kind of liked each other. They have this kind of connection. I love this picture. I think it's just hysterical. This is right after they signed the peace agreement. It reminds me of something like, when do you smoke a cigarette? After what? After you sign a peace agreement. So here's the peace agreement in a nutshell. They basically agree on their territorial disputes. They agree on water, that they're going to share some water with from the Jordan River with Jordan. They're not going to allow any attacks by a third party against the other country. This is mostly Israel wants that. All the Islamic sites in Jerusalem would be given high priority when Israel and Palestinians negotiate Jerusalem's fate. In other words, this is an agreement with Jordan that, you know, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and other kinds of religious sites would be protected. Refugees would be addressed, and the commitment was there to relieve the suffering of refugees, and to deal with the displaced people, Palestinians who are in Jordan. And Israel meant money, and of course that they were going to cooperate economically, which was the key thing for King Hussein. That's one of the big things he wants to do. So in terms of transportation, water, energy, tourism, et cetera, et cetera. And this is held ever since that time. I don't have time to get into the narratives, but I did want to stop and just point out that these are two back-to-back agreements in the space of 2 years that just transformed the entire Middle East. And in case you're wondering, is Oslo even relevant? It's still relevant. We're still talking about Oslo. We're still talking about the two-state solution. And when we talk about the two-state solution, we're talking about the Oslo framework. What happens from there on in the implementation, so-called Oslo II, and subsequent efforts to sort of resolve those long-term issues is another story for next week. But this sets that all in motion. And then not the first, but the second Arab nation bordering on Israel that now has a peace agreement with Israel. Now Egypt, now Jordan on one side and on the other side, west and east of Israel. So that's a pretty big deal. So let me open it up and ask if you guys have any questions, or sorry with all the glitches we've had.
It's all right. Boom happens. Donna did great. It's what I want to ask you is that since then, things are not too great right now, but did that all unravel?
Yes, everything unravels.
Unraveled.
The least of which is that Rabin is assassinated.
That's right. I remember that.
Sharon emerges as the leader. There's the second Intifada. There's a lot of violence that happens.
Thanks.
What I want to do next week was we'll begin talking about what were the conditions that made it possible to get to this moment. And I've talked a lot about the shift from bipolar world to unipolar world. There's also key elections. In Israel, a labor government comes to power. In the United States, Secretary of State Baker, who was very cold with, to say the least, with Israel, very sympathetic to the Arabs, is replaced, and Clinton comes into power, and he's dedicated to getting a peace agreement. So these things matter a lot. Of course, the incomparable leadership of Yitzhak Rabin, and then there's this giant persona of Yasser Arafat. So all of that matters, and all of that's off the stage soon after this. Michael.
I'd like to add a comment about King Hussein. You mentioned that Rabin and Hussein liked each other. As it turns out, Hussein is one of I hold him in the highest esteem. Imagine, several years after the peace agreement with Jordan, some Israeli high school female students happened to be visiting near the Jordan River, and a Jordanian soldier killed half a dozen of them. Do you know what King did? He went and visited each family in person and went on his knees asking forgiveness. Asking forgiveness on his knees, the king. Would you believe that? That such was a human being. Unbelievable. Brings me to tears now as I tell you that.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's incredible. Yeah, I mean, you kind of got the feeling here that Hussein, once he could get rid of like the obligation to take care of the Palestinian issue, that was a huge burden. I mean, he didn't want to give up the entire West Bank, but on the other hand, like if that meant resolving Palestinian independence for them, that was just a challenging, impossible situation. And so, of course, he didn't get along with Arafat and or any of the Palestinian leadership, PLO leadership. And so once that was off the table, it just opened up this. He also had a very good relationship with Clinton, very good relationship. So a lot of this stuff I'm always fascinated by. There are these big factors like the end of the Cold War and major shifts in power from Likud to Labor and things like that. But then in a way, it all comes down to who are these men and women who are doing this. And in this case, it's mostly men. And what kind of character they have. I mentioned James Baker and versus Bill Clinton as the peacemaker for the United States. Okay, well, listen, I went way over my time. I'm super sorry about that. Thank you for hanging out with me so I could get to this point. Next week, we look at the trajectory of the Oslo framework and what happens to it and how it unravels. And then the week after that, we'll look at the second Intifada. And then the last week, we'll look at contemporary affairs from the perspective going backwards. Yeah.
Scott, very quickly, sorry. I don't know. I just want to say, I don't know if you've been doing this. Would it be possible to send copies of the slides that you're having?
Yes, I meant to do that last week. I'll send that. Oh, one other thing. Let me just